Morning, everyone. I think we'll make a start. If you still can't hear me speaking now, please do type in the chat or try leaving and rejoining, but you should have sound now. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm very pleased to introduce this masterclass on digital access for all. This is the penultimate masterclass of 5, which forms part of the Local Government Association CHIP Digital Support Programme. My name's Georgia. I'm from the LGA CHIP digital team, leading on this programme, which is funded by NHS, now, of course, NHS Transformation Directorate. It's great to be working with Rethink Partners again on this programme, who've developed a really useful tool for the masterclass today. But before we get to that, there are just a few ground rules. Next slide, please, Elle. We do recommend that you turn your videos off to ensure best connectivity, and if you can please put yourself on mute as well to avoid audio interference, that would be much appreciated. Please do hold questions until our Q&A. However, you can add them in the chat as we go along if you wish. If you do ask a question or have any comments, please do state your name and organisation. That would be most appreciated. We started recording this webinar as we'll be sharing the recording alongside slides, materials and Q&As afterwards, so please keep an eye out for that email. If you wish, you can also tweet about this event online via the hashtag LGA Digital, but please be aware if you do tweet that others may not wish to feature. Next slide, please, Elle. So today we'll be answering these key questions. When we consider the application of digital to enhance the lives of people we support, are we also considering the barriers to this, both seen and unseen? How do we place the individual at the heart of our considerations to increase inclusion and personalisation? And how aware are we of our own assumptions and digital bias and how it can influence the decisions we make? So really interesting topics we're going to be covering today. Next slide, please, Elle. We're really lucky to have with us today Chris Pope from Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Theo Jarrett from Lincolnshire County Council, and Caroline Poole from NHS England and NHS Improvement. But first, Rethink Partners Claire Morris will be setting the scene of digital access for all. Thanks, Claire.
Brilliant. Thanks, Georgia, for that introduction. I'm breaking with tradition this morning, so I have no slides for my section, but I am just going to speak to you a little bit about the context and background for this masterclass. Interestingly, we actually debated the title for this masterclass quite a lot, Digital Access for All. I'm going to unpick that a bit because that might in and of itself be quite a provocative topic. I don't know, a name for the masterclass. But I guess the point about this masterclass is that it is in part about digital inclusion, and great to have Chris here who's going to share the experiences of the Manchester system in progressing this agenda. But actually digital inclusion and some of the mechanics of that is not enough. And this masterclass is about much more than that. It's about what we organisationally kind of bring to this work, how some of our own thinking and processes actually might either intentionally or unintentionally inhibit take-up of digital technologies, but also very much what we bring of ourselves to this work. So digital access for all fundamentally isn't about one size fits all. This programme this morning and our kind of ambition, I guess, and our kind of passion as Rethink is that this is about personalised tech, and it's about seeing the person, their circumstances, their strengths, their needs, ambitions, and linking all of this to a great technology offer, and then wrapping around the conditions and support that will enable them to benefit and be included. Rethink has done lots of work at the front line, as you probably have heard from us, with councils and with communities, with people. And I just want to share a few little sound bites of what I've heard even over the last kind of 6 months or so. So I was working with a group of social workers recently, and they were working with adults with learning disabilities, and I heard a social worker say really clearly, adults with learning disabilities don't want technology, they want people and they want contact. Now, I'm sure they do want people and contact, but I think they might want technology too. And but that, you know, perfectly reasonable, maybe familiar kind of comment to you. And that's some of what we kind of hear when we do this work. When we were working with councils during COVID and having to roll out adapted tablets, video care phones, what we saw particularly with adults with learning disabilities is the autonomy and control that having their own device gave them. And there was a particular kind of family, a guy in his 20s and his father, who said, this device is brilliant because Mark now doesn't have to sit by me and use my phone. He can take it into his bedroom, he can chat to his friends, he's completely independent. And so that social worker comment, that brought that full circle, because actually the technology was absolutely enabling that contact and that contact with people. So there is little kind of threads in all of us and in our services and in our training and in our professions that we sort of bring to this work that might unconsciously be inhibiting how positive we are about how people do this work. Recently, I was with some tech companies. There was a sort of showcase going on, providers showing their wares. And one of the big tech providers sort of said, well, obviously we don't give people smartwatches because we don't want the Daily Mail headlines of seeing that councils have funded people with smartwatches. And I was sitting there, and actually some of my the council colleagues I was sitting there thinking, yes, we do. We do want that. We do want our people to have smartwatches. We want them to have great technology. Why wouldn't we want that for them? And if it's an important part of how they live independently, how they achieve their goals, how they might be able to get to work in the morning safely, how they can use transport. Again, so just an interesting kind of thread unconsciously of what we bring to this work. And you have these little moments when some of this is kind of outed and shared. And then I've also been involved in actually trying to work with some of our superfast programs, broadband rollout programs with councils, and trying to connect that to this adult social care digital agenda. And interestingly, one council's superfast team were working really hard with their planning teams to try and change planning guidance so that broadband and connectivity was a requirement, a utility was how they used to refer to it. So in the same way that we have water connected to all our homes and we have electricity connected to all of our homes, that we also have broadband connected to all of our homes. And that sounds kind of obvious to me, and I didn't know it wasn't a requirement, but it isn't. And again, just some really practical kind of targeted ways that this sort of seeps through all of our different pieces of work and the joining up to try and actually let everyone, so digital access for all. It doesn't mean the same, but actually everyone has the opportunity to access digital provision in their lives. So we're going to go on a bit of a journey this morning, and Chris is very much going to share what they've learned in Greater Manchester, looking at digital inclusion, so almost at a population level. And then we're handing over to colleagues from Lincolnshire who are going to talk about their work focusing on a particular cohort, learning disabilities, and what they've learned at an organisational level. And then delighted to have Caroline Pope with us this morning from NHS England and Improvement, who's actually then going to get really deep down and personal, because that is a really important part of this agenda. What am I consciously or unconsciously bringing to this work in terms of my assumptions about what I think people are entitled to and what is fit for purpose for people? So a really great kind of journey we're going on this morning. I'm just going to come back up to Chris and digital inclusion, and one more little anecdote from me. So a few years ago, I was approached by Active Essex, which is the sports partnership for Essex, about getting involved in and their remit is basically how to get everybody active, a really important part of health. Yes, there's elite sport in there, but actually their mission in Essex was to have 1 million active adults in Essex, so most of the Essex population. And what I learnt in doing that work was fascinating to me, in that I guess not surprisingly, but the people who are inactive and are excluded from activity. There is an inclusion and exclusion thread to physical activity. Funnily enough, was all of those same protected characteristics and the same issues that we see people experiencing exclusion from work, from education, from technology. So it is about gender, it was about age, it was about hugely about socioeconomic background. There was race in there as well, and disability was a thread. So somehow we come back to a number of these characteristics each time, but we need to look at it in the context of the work that we're doing. I just hold that in your heads, because if we're looking at people who are digitally excluded, they may well be excluded from a number of other parts of life and things that we all take for granted as part of how we live and work and play and love. I'm really pleased that during COVID-19, we've seen digital inclusion rocket up the agenda. And thinking back 3 or 4 years ago, it was hard to get people to talk about this. It was hard to find resources. And COVID, if there is one of the silver lines of that, is that actually this is something we're now able to talk about. And I'm actually seeing it in people's jobs. I'm seeing people put resources into it. But we've got an awful long way to go still, I think. And I still see digital inclusion programs where the default is that it's about skills. Skills is really important, but it's not enough in and of itself. And we've really seen that play out during COVID. Costs of data, access to devices, poor connectivity, all of those things kind of playing into the mix. And I just want to give you a tiny little quote. So from Everyone ran a 2020 digital attitude survey, and this is a great quote from them. They said in 2020, this year's research finds people continue to feel the internet is better for them as individuals than for society as a whole, but the benefits are not evenly shared. The rich are more positive about tech than the poor, risking the creation of a new class of the tech left behind. So that is absolutely what this work is about. How do we make sure we don't consciously or unconsciously create in our work that class of the tech left behind? So enjoy our speakers this morning, hold that ambition and opportunity in your heads. And I'm now going to hand over to Chris Pope from the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, who's going to share the research and work, practical work that they've done in Manchester to take this work forward. Chris, over to you.
Thanks a lot for that, Claire. I really appreciate the invite today, and completely agree with you on that. We definitely don't want people left behind in any way in Greater Manchester. So hello everyone, I'm Chris Pope. I work at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority in the research team, and in particular I support the digital policy team with a specific focus on digital inclusion. In Greater Manchester, we've been working with partners around the city region as well as around the country in the past few years to better understand digital inclusion and what it really means for us. We've worked with the public sector, the private sector, the third sector, organisations like Virgin Media and Good Things Foundation, as well as academics from the University of Liverpool, the Ada Lovelace Foundation and the University of Cambridge as well. And I wanted to talk to you today about how research and intelligence can form a really good foundation for your activities, as well as some of the pitfalls we've encountered along the way. I also want to talk about starting your journey and starting to define the kind of the indefinable, just what is digital exclusion. And it's something we've grappled with, and I'm sure many of you here will have done too. And lastly, kind of throughout the session today, I really want you to have a think about just one question. Does your attendance at this meeting today mean that you're digitally included? And I kind of hope to show that it's not a really simple answer to that question as we go along. So next slide, please. So what exactly is digital exclusion then? Well, it's often considered everyone's problem, but no one's responsibility. And why is that? Well, if we look at the next slide, it's very much like a river. It runs through everything that we do. It affects many people and many organisations, from the public and the private sector, delivering services more effectively, to individuals unable to access either cheaper deals online, or to see their GP, or to talk to their family and their friends. Next slide, please. And I suppose for northern audiences, here's another kind of graphic for it, really. However you cut it, you always see digital inclusion threaded through everything we do as a public sector. And that's why many places in the country, like Greater Manchester, as well as the local government association, today Rethink Partners, DCMS, and private and third sector partners as well, are also trying to take more responsibility around this issue, because it cuts across so many different departments, so many different directorates, so many different things that we do. Next slide, please. So when we start on our journey to tackling digital exclusion, we really need to think about the importance of language here. Many of these phrases are actually used interchangeably, but they're not all the same thing. They are about a central problem of digital exclusion and digital participation, but they each mean something slightly different. So it's very important to think about how we are defining digital exclusion and what language we're particularly using. Next slide, please. So focusing on digital exclusion, how are we best defining this? Does it just include getting people online? I think Claire mentioned it was often seen as just a skills issue. Or actually, is it about access? One question that's come up with us is, what about people who can't use a digital display on their boiler? Are they digitally excluded because they can't use a digital display? And I think if you ask 10 people, you get 748 different answers about what digital exclusion is. And that's because digital exclusion is very hard to define. It's very personal. And we'll talk about kind of the personalization, the personal point later on in this session. And it's personal because it's really the way you feel that you may be limited, and the barriers that you may experience. It's also very situational, in that you may have access to the internet at work or at school, but you don't have access at home. It's very time dependent as well. So, your skills and your confidence can vary and can wane as well over time. And it also depends on who's defining what it means to be excluded. Digital exclusion isn't a simple binary position. You're either included or you're excluded. It's more like a continuum. So where do you draw the line on that continuum from digital inclusion to digital exclusion? So next slide, please. I think if you're starting to look at the research and the intelligence, the data that's out there to help you with this, I think you really need to be aware if you're trying to think of digital exclusion as just a simple figure. The main data sets that we all access on this and we all use don't actually show what you think they do, or even what you might want. The census last year, it was completed mainly online, but people could request paper copies. So technically, there's an indicator there of the areas that did and didn't complete the census online, that could be used as a good indicator of digital inclusion or exclusion. But is it really? The Office of National Statistics sent out paper copies to areas that they expected to be digitally excluded anyway. So that's just going to skew the results. And some people's family or friends, my grandmother-in-law, for example, her census was submitted online by her son. Some people may have family or friends who are actually connected and may have submitted a census response online, in which case what you're measuring there is actually whether or not someone has access to someone else who is digitally included. Another indicator that's used quite often is whether or not people have used the internet in the last 3 months, another ONS figure. It's a good indicator, but it's not necessarily digital inclusion. They may have used the internet at work, they may have used it in a library, but they may still be digitally excluded, at home. or they may have been able to afford an internet connection kind of 3 months ago or sporadically over the last 3 months, but not right now. As I mentioned before, digital exclusion can be very time and place dependent. Ofcom also produced some information on the numbers of premises that are unable to access good connectivity. But this is just one aspect of digital exclusion. Affordability, skills, confidence levels, whether someone even uses a connection to their home, they all have an impact. And they all help you to define and think about digital exclusion in a different way. Next slide, please. So in Greater Manchester, we've taken an economics type approach to the definition of digital exclusion. In economics, someone who's unemployed has to kind of, 1, not have a job, 2, be looking for a job, and 3, be able to take a job if offered. So someone who's in full-time education probably can't take a job, and someone who's a pensioner probably could take a job, but probably isn't looking. So there's that willing and able component there. And it's the same with digital exclusion and digital participation. Digital exclusion for us is those people experiencing a barrier to their ability to use the internet and to use digital services in the way that they want. And we recognise that those barriers can come and go and can change over time. Digital participation for us is the degree to which people use digital services. And similarly, this can change over time as well. And the two are related and they can affect one another, but they're not the same. Remember, just because someone doesn't have barriers to using digital services doesn't mean that they want to use digital services. For example, an Age UK survey recently indicated around 85% of people aged 75 and above who were not online didn't want to be online. So you need to take account of these things when you're thinking about the information that you're pulling together around digital inclusion and exclusion. Next slide, please. So that definition that we use around willing and able, that's right for us, and you need to work out what your definition is, what's right for you, and who you specifically want to support as well. And once you start on your definition, you can start to build up more knowledge and understanding. So your definition of digital exclusion and your understanding of your priority groups in your area, and we'll come on to some of your priority groups in a bit. That kind of provides the foundation for a lot of your work, the concrete, as it will, of your work. And on top of this, you can add breeze blocks, understanding digital exclusion in more detail, understanding your priority groups and what they need, and starting to map what support is out there, what support's available in your local area. And in turn, this helps you build more knowledge about what works, what doesn't, and how you might be able to do more. And if you allow me to stretch that metaphor a little bit further, stronger engagement, communication, leadership in this area, they kind of form that mortar that holds those bricks together. Next slide, please. So in Greater Manchester, we're always told by the Mayor, by Andy Burnham, names, not numbers. And I'm sure everyone here is probably told the same thing as well. We estimate that there's around 1.2 million people in Greater Manchester who are limited digital users. So that means people who are digitally excluded and are limited digital participants as well. And that's out of a population of 2.8 million. But we want to know who is impacted so we can target services effectively. Truth is, though, it's not that easy. If you look at the next slide, we know that there's not a single consistent database that shows the extent of digital inclusion or exclusion. Individual districts may have their own flags on their client management systems that identify whether someone wants to be contacted by email or not. But not every local authority is the same, and not every local authority and not every public sector organisation captures information in the same way, or even captures the same information. So next slide, please. For us, we had to get to names, not numbers. And I'm going to be honest with you here, we cheated in Greater Manchester. We cheated in two ways. Firstly, we looked at what had been done before. places like the West Midlands, Salford, Manchester, Glasgow, Westminster, they'd all developed their own tools and their own models of understanding digital exclusion. And we spoke to them all, and they all seemed to be kind of doing the same thing, maybe with the same kind of data, but just doing it for their one area. So we took one model of digital exclusion, Salford City Councils. We copied it and pasted it, changed it a little bit around, and we've expanded it nationally. And the second thing that we did to cheat was we didn't actually get to names. We took a step closer to names rather than getting to the actual names. We didn't get all the way there. We instead focused on what a lot of the tools and the models out there had focused on already, risk factors. Next slide, please. So what are some of the biggest risk factors in being digitally excluded? Well, age is a big one, as is income and education. And we look through all of these. And there's a lot of kind of evidence out there from academia. If you want to kind of go and find it, I'm more than happy to kind of provide links. But we looked through these and we identified 12 indicators to use. And quite a lot of these indicators and quite a lot of these risk factors here are quite closely correlated. So we collated them into three groups: the demographics of residents, the risk factors associated with the deprivation of the place, and risk factors associated with internet connectivity. Next slide, please. From all of that, we developed an open, free data set, so you can all use it, the Digital Exclusion Risk Index. It shows Greater Manchester on the image there, but it does cover all of England, Scotland and Wales, and every lower super output area in England and Wales and every data zone in Scotland gets a score from 0 to 10, where 0 is low risk of digital exclusion and 10 is high risk. We then built a tool to explore the data, what you can see on the screen there. We made the data and the methodology open on GitHub so anyone can access it, and we made the tool open using Tableau so anyone can access it from anywhere online. We made it flexible because some policy officers may want to understand digital exclusion from a deprivation lens or from a demographic lens. And so users can change some of the inputs that go into the calculations and see what that means for digital exclusion in their area and whether or not it highlights other areas within their district. I'll share the links for all this, by the way, at the end of the presentation. I'll stick them in the chat if people are interested. And yes, we get the irony of creating an online-only digital exclusion risk tool. We get the irony. We're trying to make the information more open, and we're trying to engage with a lot of our libraries and community organisations to ensure that they are aware of this as well and they can use it to best support local residents. But what I should highlight here is that we've developed a tool. We've not developed the tool. This is a tool, and you'll probably need lots of tools in your toolbox when you're thinking about tackling digital exclusion. We can provide some. I'd strongly recommend looking at Leeds City Council's Digital Inclusion Toolkit as a great source of kind of tools and examples for all of you. And I know that we'll also be sharing a new tool with you today, which will be discussed later on. Next slide, please. But I just want you to remember that the Digital Exclusion Risk Index, or DERI, just looks at the likelihood of digital exclusion. Technically, we probably should have called it the Digital Exclusion Likelihood Index, or DELI, but I didn't think people would take it as seriously if we just called it DELI. But impact is another aspect to consider, another important point to consider as well as likelihood, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, let's compare an 85-year-old who's never used the internet, is happy with a GP appointment over the phone, and compare them to a 6-year-old during the pandemic who can't access their school's teaching resources. Now, the impacts on these people's lives, especially in the long term, are going to be very difficult. And they're going to be very difficult and very different as well. 94% of adults who've never used the internet are aged 55 or above. But the individual lifetime impact is going to be more intense for that 0.4% of people who are aged 16 to 24 and have never accessed the internet. So there's a smaller number, but the impact is going to be greater. And just because you're more likely to be digitally excluded doesn't mean that digital exclusion is going to have a big impact on your life. That's why it's important to consider some of your priority groups. Who do you want to target in your area and who are you trying to help? The people most likely to be digital excluded are the people who are going to be impacted more by digital exclusion, or a mixture of both. And your research into digital exclusion within your area, within your locality, is really going to help you understand this. I know it might end up being a policy decision, it might be a mayoral decision, it might be a political decision about who we target. But really, your research at the starting phases around digital exclusion, around who's impacted and how much they're impacted, will really help. And the second reason that impact is important is, well, let's say we wanted to create a risk matrix like the one on the screen there. Perhaps it's helpful to think of impact as the proportion of your priority groups within an area. So you want to know areas that are at high likelihood of digital exclusion from the dairy. And you want to look at areas as well that have a high proportion of your priority group. So you want to see where there's that crossover. And those are the areas that you might want to target: high likelihood of digital exclusion, high number of people in your priority groups. We've started to do that in Greater Manchester. So we've got kind of 3 priority groups around digital exclusion: disabled people, under 25s and over 75s. Next slide, please. The next step for us was to start to map the system, what's already out there, who's providing digital inclusion support and where. We started to do that in Greater Manchester. We've made it open again. I'll put the link in for this very tiny diagram that you can see here. But it gives us an idea of what's going on, who's delivering what where, and where might there be gaps in the system that we might be able to fill. But it also shows us opportunities as well. What activities could we invest in, or could we expand, and even what could we divest from, because we already know that there's activity or support in that area of a similar nature. And the best way to do this is to engage with your local residents, with your local groups, with national networks, to form local networks as well and join existing networks, things that are already out there. Get to know your area fully. We've done this in Greater Manchester with the Digital Inclusion Task Force, around 150 odd members from public, private, third sectors in Greater Manchester, bringing them all together and sharing this information about what works. Next slide, please. So as you've done some of your system mapping, as we've done, you can start to see where activity is best targeted. So this map here kind of shows Tameside. It's where I'm from in Greater Manchester. And there's several pockets of digital exclusion according to the Digital Exclusion Risk Index. Hattersley, kind of in the southeast there, is kind of one of the main ones. It's kind of on the edge of the more rural parts of Greater Manchester. And it's a large social housing estate as well there. But when you start to overlay the activity, you know, you've engaged with local residents, you've overlaid that activity, you're pulling it all together. Once you overlay that, you can start to see something different. Maybe it isn't the places that are at a high likelihood of digital exclusion that you really need to be targeting, especially if there's existing kind of provision and support there. Maybe it's the areas with more medium levels of digital exclusion risk. There's an example there, kind of southwestwards, just below Denton. That's exactly where I'm from, actually. That little area, that little LSOA, is actually where I'm from. And it's not the highest risk of digital exclusion. It's got kind of a light reddy kind of colour to it. The redder the colour on the Digital Exclusion Risk Index, the kind of the higher the risk. But there's not a lot of activity going on in that area. Maybe that's a place where we should be targeting more investment. Next slide, please. And I will just want to end really on one final point, which is around understanding your priority groups fully. So some groups are going to require more personalised support than others, and some would be more cautious and more wary. Introducing people to the internet and to digital services can be incredibly beneficial for the individual, for you as an organisation, for the wider economy, for local businesses. But it can also bring risks. And tackling those risks and supporting people to feel confident in overcoming them should really be a key action for any activity. For example, in Greater Manchester, 22% of our households in social housing, and they're a key target group for us just generally. And we're working with the private sector and social housing providers to put in place a really big programme for the city region. We're looking at putting internet connections, devices and support in up to 5,000 social housing properties. And if it works, we want to roll out that activity to all social housing in Greater Manchester. And I recognise Claire said we don't want anyone saying that we've been providing smartphones to local residents. That's not what we're doing, or smartwatches. That's not what we're doing. We've been working with the private sector, so it'll actually be the private sector and social housing providers working together. It's not Greater Manchester throwing money at it. It's because we've been able to create that engagement between the private and the third sector and social housing providers that we've been able to create this programme. But we need to be aware of the potential risks that this involves and the harms that can arise here. And so support around recognising scams, online risks for families, and support for vulnerable adults and children will definitely be built into that programme, because access for all can lead to risks for all. So next slide, please. What can you do? Well, define what digital exclusion means for your area and define your priority groups. Understand digital exclusion, who it affects, how it affects those people, and what existing support is already on the ground. Engage with people, learn what people need, bring them into the decision-making process, like bring people together, local networks as well as local residents. Build your knowledge base by working with those local residents groups and engaging with partners, not just locally, but nationally as well. You know, your surrounding districts, it's always helpful to bring them in. And aim at all times to reduce the risks from increasing digital inclusion. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. I hope this has been useful and insightful. I'll start to put some of those links on the chat. But if you do have any questions later on, I'll try and answer them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. That was just brilliant. Just really, really good, bringing it to life and very, very human. Thank you so much. I just want to highlight just briefly now before I hand on to our next speaker, Theo, the tool that we've pulled together that Chris has mentioned. I feel slightly sort of humble in doing this now, because I think, as Chris has said, there's lots of good stuff out there. But we've been working with Chris to sort of pull out some of what he's learned in doing the work in Greater Manchester. It is structured with these building blocks, as you can see on this diagram. And then we created a set of sort of activities, tasks, action tables to start to get you into this work. It's by no means definitive, but it is another kind of piece of insight, helpfulness into this space around how you kind of get hold of this digital inclusion agenda. The link, a colleague will post the link to the tool shortly in the chat, but it's on the digital platform where the slides and recording for this will also sit, so all together for you all. So do have a look at that. We've sucked a huge amount of information out of Chris's brain talking to him over the last few months, so I hope that's useful for you all. Right, lovely. I'm now going to hand over to, so we've had names, not numbers, and population, but a demographic and population view. I'm now going to hand over to Theo Jarrett from Lincolnshire County Council, who are going to share, and then we've been working with them over the last few months to help them think about kind of digital access for all in the context of Lincolnshire, a very different place from Manchester, but also particularly focusing on adults with learning disabilities. Theo, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. So we have got a lot more thinking to do, especially seeing some of the tools and thinking that Chris has presented there. So I think what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes is just really talk about the latest leg of our journey that we've probably been on since about midway through 2018, when in the County Council we started to look at how could we use and embrace digital technologies in lots of different ways in terms of being able to make it, well, improve social care for adults and our wellbeing services. So at that time, we developed a digital roadmap, and we started down a couple of different routes, which we've really majored on. Firstly, around self-serve capability for people who have got the will and the ability to do that. So self-serve, self-management, and self-help tools for individuals where that's appropriate. And then also what we've done is we've had a big part of the programme looking at what we can do as a council to support social care providers and service providers around the county in terms of bringing them up to levels where they're going to be able to be on a par with NHS organisations and with the council, and consequently improving care for people and the links to the NHS. We've done that because, as the picture shows, Lincolnshire, and as has been mentioned, Lincolnshire is a very different place to Manchester. It's not unique in the UK, but it has a lot of the challenges that, if we could get it right, digital care could really help us with. So it's sparsely populated. There's pretty poor transport links. Travelling around for individuals who need care and also those people who work in the care workforce is difficult in Lincolnshire. What we've also got is a very, very fast reducing working age population. So we have a challenge around our social care workforce. So we needed to think differently. So that's where we've started from. As I mentioned, we're still on that journey. Okay, so if we have the next slide, please. Okay, so where we were, and I think we can just click on, there's a bit more to that slide. So firstly, it has taken a while, but certainly, as Claire mentioned, the pandemic has opened people's eyes, certainly our politicians, our senior leaders, colleagues, and partners around the fact that digital can be something that potentially could help us in terms of delivery and management of care in the county. So do more of it. There was no specific ask. It was just do more. That's good what you've done, but you need to do more. We had and still have fairly traditional telecare offer. Most people on the call will recognise the device that's shown there. And we have had that traditional telecare offer in place for quite a long time. We knew we needed to change there. The field at the bottom, fields do feature quite a lot in this presentation, but it's come to stand for a sort of perception of how possible is digital in Lincolnshire. Vast swathes of the county are like this, and some of the challenges that we face are really not just around the connectivity and the usage and the links. They're also about people's perceptions. We've lived so long in this area, understanding that there are difficulties around connection. It's almost become ingrained. So most people that we talk to have got a story of not being able to get a phone signal or the internet being really poor. And that is something, again, that we're having to overcome in this request to do more digital. So if we can move on to the next slide. And probably midway through the pandemic, we started to have ideas of what we needed to get to in terms of not just some of the digital projects that we've had already, but the focus on actually how could digital, in terms of devices, and it could be smartwatches, apps, software, how could that help people to live healthy, safe, independent lives? And so what we wanted to do is we started to look towards what would the future look like. And I think at that point, when we started working with Rethink, the future was a bright one, but it wasn't clear. It's something bright, shiny future that's through the clouds, but we needed to get there. And also the scale of the ask was fairly overwhelming. So if we move on to the next slide, what we found that we actually had a number of pieces of work, a number of either projects or themes that were already in train that we could use to try and chunk up the problem. And what we wanted to do is effectively start to think about how we could align and sequence these things to make sure that things were happening at the right time. So the first point there is that we were doing some work with an organisation called Empower within adult social care on an improvement and development programme. One of the focuses of that programme was bringing out a different conversation that our social work practitioners could have with individuals. Most people on the call will be familiar with strength-based approach, looking at what assets people have got rather than just banging a service in. And so what we wanted to do is to add to that conversation aspects of what could technology do, as well as a person's skills, as well as a person's network of support. Actually, have they got technology themselves, or an interest or an ability to use technology that we could use as part of that strength-based approach? So that is something that we're moving forward with, and it's ongoing at the moment. But we brought that technology into that conversation. Secondly, we are at the point of recommissioning our telecare contract, which is up fairly soon. So it's an opportunity for us to look differently about what we want in the future. And the current thinking is around a digital care service that would also have aspects of support for both staff, families, and people that need care and support in terms of guiding them, in terms of what might be right for them, what is possible, and what's available. The third point there, demand for digital. We had and we still have a corporate digital program, increasing efficiency and ways of working in the council. What we've done within adult social care is to look and see what we can start with. We've still got the telecare offer, but what we're doing is a number of pilots that have grown over the past couple of years, where we're testing out people's willingness and ability to use devices, and also their reaction. What are the barriers? What are the positives that we're getting from these? And then the final point there is just challenging those preconceptions. The field that showed earlier really is that summary of the preconceptions that people might have about whether it's worthwhile doing digital in Lincolnshire for care and support. What we're saying, actually, we're building up an evidence chest of positive examples, the ability of ways around things, ways around why things might work and what impact it might have on people. Okay, if we can have the next slide. Okay, so what we wanted to do, as Claire mentioned, was really focus on one particular area. What we did through the pilots, through discussions with a number of different stakeholders, and also our staff through our strength-based approach sessions, is that we realised that there was a public perception that was around digital in care being very much around older people being taught how to use a simple digital device. So this particular picture that you can see on the screen is taken from an Amazon advert where a younger carer is demonstrating to an older person who initially doesn't seem too bothered about using the device, about the benefits. So there was a real focus, and that just came up again and again when we were talking to our staff, families, and the people who use care about that perception of care tech is always about older people. So we wanted to actually talk with individuals who perhaps were younger adults who had autism, learning disability, and steer down that route, which seemed to be less trodden for us, or less fully aware. What we found as well through the strength-based approach sessions and also the reaction to the digital pilots that we put in place was that very much that families, carers, and also sometimes our staff could be the gatekeepers to whether someone was able to use technology, would they be able to access that technology or not, regardless of the impact that it had on their lives. And what we found was that the lack of understanding and the fear of technology was actually stopping that impact being felt for the individual. So it's that gatekeeping nature that we're interested in, and what we wanted to do was to see how we could overcome that in terms of building up a sort of confidence in being able to discuss technology with people with a learning disability or autism. Some of the comments that we got back was, are we allowed to do this? We'll never get connection. Hence, back to the field that we mentioned earlier. Is it safe? Can this technology be trusted? And is it safe once people are online? A person, I think Claire mentioned earlier, conversation with social care staff where someone was advised that an individual couldn't use technology or they couldn't use the internet. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, what we've found is that these are just a few comments that have come out in the strength-based approach sessions that are ongoing at the moment, not particularly focused on care and moving forward, not particularly focused on technology, but moving forward, technology will be part of those discussions. What we're wanting to do is to build up, in effect, it's a snowball that's building up over time, positive feedback, examples that are then being used to feed that discussion in the future. And what we found as well is that the degree of inventiveness and ideas around what is possible actually with those staff who are working with people with a learning disability and autism, it's the range is huge, and it's perhaps more acute, the potential is there to really change people's lives. So it's about tapping into that potential, and what we're looking at is feeding practitioners, feeding families, carers with that confidence, with that evidence that actually these things can work and they can support people effectively, despite some of the misgivings that we might have. So we're working on that. So these quotes, literally every month we get more and more of these in. But what we're wanting to do is to work with a number of key stakeholders that we've identified. And some of those people are the gatekeepers that we talked about. Others are groups that might be peer groups or might be community groups that represent people with a learning disability or autism. What we're wanting to do is to work with them in terms of building that snowball effectively to the point where it's able to roll on its own. I'm going to move on to the last slide that just gives us, there we go, there's some sort of animation in there. So just in terms of what we want to do moving forwards, as I said at the start, we're still on this journey, and we have in no way changed culture, full stop. But what we are doing is we're moving forward. So what we want to do next is to engage with individuals, engage with people who use those social care services, and those outside, people who perhaps are more independent, engage with the families, the carers, just around how they would want to access digital, what it might do to keep them independent, what it does to link them into the life that they want to have. From that, we think we can probably build something that will actually give more confidence in the future for our practitioners, families and carers in terms of being able to consider digital moving forward. What we're thinking is if we get it right with that particular cohort, that particular group of staff, families and carers, then actually we want to transfer this elsewhere into other services, wellbeing services that support people with older people and frailty and physical disabilities. What we're moving towards, as I mentioned earlier, is that recommissioned telecare, that new approach to a digital care service that we're calling that at the moment. So the engagement and the learning through the journey that we've been on needs to go into the specification and to shape that, how that behaves, how that is accessed, and how that works in the future. And I mentioned one of the key things earlier was around recognising that fear and the confidence amongst our staff. Perhaps we need to build that, we need to support that, and that's something that we're going to do with that digital care service. So that ends my slides. I'm going to pass on to Caroline now, who's got some really key messages about self-discovery and things that she's discovered over the last, I don't know how long, Caroline, quite probably over the last year, certainly.
Oh gosh, longer than that. Yeah, okay. You're outing me as being kind of stepping towards my retirement now. But yeah, so it's been a lifelong journey of learning. And thank you so much for 2 inspiring talks. Actually, so many things were triggering in my mind around strength-based, assets-based working. So hello, everybody, and I'm absolutely delighted to join you today. And thank you to Irene and Rethink Partners for the invitation to speak today. It's a real privilege, and I just want to applaud the great work that you're all doing around inclusion, which is really close to my heart. So I'll make no apologies. My presentation this morning is intentionally somewhat provocative. And what I would invite you to listen with some fascination, but to recognise if I'm triggering any reactions while you listen, potentially some defensiveness. I don't know. It'd be interesting for you to notice that while you go through. And what I would really like is by the end of my session with you that we've all come together and got a little bit more comfortable with the stuff that's really uncomfortable. So I'm Caroline, by the way. I'm professionally a speech and language therapist. I happen to have landed in what I consider to be the best job in my career, which is head of allied health professions, 14 professions, and I work in an improvement space. My lifelong ambition has been empowering, working with staff or staff to achieve their best, so that we can work with our service users, our citizens, for them to achieve their best. That's what drives me in my day-to-day. So I'm going to tell a personal story of my life and my learning and what it means to me in my leadership journey, and how I wish I knew then what I know now, I guess. So next slide, please. So as I alluded to before, I'm tapping on the door of retirement. I was born in the 60s. And just a few images here that kind of indicate my upbringing and my early years. So I was born into a really stereotypical family. My dad was a director of finance. He went to work early, came back late. And my mum worked part-time in very gender typical roles, working with children, doing some shop work, etc. And was always there for us with a home cooked dinner on the table. So not surprisingly, the influences in my early childhood impacted and embedded deeply in who I am and as a person, how I thought of myself and what I thought I might achieve actually in my life. So the careers advice for ambitious women is a bit tongue-in-cheek actually, because that wasn't a book that I would have read in my early teens. And indeed, I left school at 16 and didn't go on to do any further education, despite having skills and aptitude to do so, and went into secretarial work. That was my first stage of my career. I just wanted to touch on, there's a school photograph there. I hope you can see it well, but just notice the obvious lack of diversity in my school setting. So I lived in a I wouldn't say we were wealthy, but certainly we were comfortable. There was always food on the table. The house was always warm. We had what we needed. And most of my peers were just the same. We lived in that kind of area. You'll notice there a sea of white faces. That really constitutes my upbringing. So not only was my exposure to diversity very limited in my early childhood, something that I've only recently reflected so deeply on what that means and why that matters, but there were other aspects of diversity as well. So I guess in my school we were all able-bodied. We had, there was really very little reference to sexuality, to gender issues. And I'll share with you, I don't know if anybody else on the call will reflect, but, a picture of George Michael there, when he eventually came out as gay, that was a real shock to me and my friends, which when you look in our times now feels a ridiculous thing, but that's how it was. And that was my life then. So those childhood experiences and formative experiences are really deeply rooted in our psyche, in the stories that we tell ourselves, in the beliefs that we hold about the world, about our lives and about the possibilities. That will be the same for all of you, although I make no assumptions that your lives were anything like my lives. Perhaps there are people on the call that recognise some of what I say. Next slide, please. So here's me today, 57 and a half. It's not my lounge, but actually it's not unlike my lounge. It's really comfy. I'm very, very privileged to live in a home where equally I have food in the fridge and I have warmth when I need it. That's my friendship group that you'll see there in our lovely static caravan in Anglesey. And you'll see again, visually a real lack of diversity from if we look at skin colour and use that as a proxy measure. We're all able-bodied. We all live in similar kind of circumstances. And the picture at the bottom is an image of our Chief Allied Health Professions Officers Awards ceremony from a couple of years ago. And, there is a significant lack, I think it's fair to say, of diversity. So my life from the beginning and the middle and still continues to be mostly surrounded by people living with white privilege, being able-bodied and being quite comfortable in that position. So I looked down the list of names on the call today and I've made some assumptions about who's on the call based on the familiarity of the English names that I see in there. So apologies if those assumptions are not entirely correct. But actually, I'm thinking again about the panel of speakers, making no criticism, just noticing and being curious that there appears to be a distinct lack of diversity in the group that's speaking today. So I'd invite you to do the same. Have a look at the list down the list of names and have a think about who's turned up today, who's leading this work, who's developing this work, and what do you notice about who's not here? Because that's really important. Next slide, please. So in my latest job that I've been in the last 5 years, I've been really, really privileged. Again, we start with privilege and we gather more privilege as we go along. It kind of is the way that our world works at the moment. Went on some amazing leadership development, the Nye Bevan course, which is an NHS leadership course, and started to really unpick and understand a little bit more deeply my life and my privileges, and what that meant about how I thought and where my blind spots are and just quite how many blind spots I actually was living with. So it would be great to point you in the direction. If you Google some of these tools, you'll be able to find them. The white privilege, unpacking the invisible knapsack. It's a brilliant little tool, and the male privilege checklist. Both of them, Peggy McIntosh was the author of the white privilege document, and the male privilege is an imitation. But it speaks to me really widely, particularly the male privilege checklist. As a woman, I understand, and reading through that list, actually, it's kind of sparks a bit of anger around where I might be excluded in terms of fair opportunity. It's a more difficult read for me when I read the white privilege checklist, because what I recognise is I'm on the better end of most of the statements that are written in there. So those of us living in a society where white privilege wields power and opportunity, that can be a really uncomfortable thing, because it jars perhaps with the values of who we are. And I'm guessing, you know, this group is similar to the group I work with. We come to this kind of job because we want to really work with people and support people to do well. We've got those kind of real deep intrinsic values. So when we read something that makes us feel individually that perhaps, you know, we're not getting too bad a deal out of all of this, that can feel really uncomfortable, but something I would urge you to go read. So the other little image that I've put up for you there is kind of the reality of what that means. So the image on the left there, you know, if we think about where we are at the moment, so me as a white person, probably I've got a lot of boxes stacked, and it's not difficult for me to get an interview. If I get an interview, it's not difficult for me to get a job. It's not difficult for me to get a good home. It's not difficult for me to live in an area where privilege is rife. That's the reality of the society that we live in, where you know, we have systemic racism. And if we look at all the protected characteristics, we recognise that each of those protected characteristics, if we live with one or more of those, then we're probably going to have a few boxes knocked out from that great big pile. So equality, we talk about equality, don't we? I love this image, because actually what equality means is everybody's got the same leg up, but actually that doesn't mean everybody's got the same opportunity. So I think for me, much more thinking about equity. So different groups of our societies need different interventions and different opportunities to level the playing field. So we're having some really rich conversations in our team at the moment, we're creating an anti-racist culture, being proactive around how we start to challenge. And the conversations we have are really fascinating to explore where we are all on that journey. And again, you know, if we think about ethnic diversity and we think about leadership, we know what that looks like at the moment. There's a lot of data around that. And in one of some of the conversations we have, it's, you know, I'm often hearing people say, yeah, but, you know, we've got to get the right person for the job, but we can't give people all these advantages because that's not fair. But if we think about that through an equity lens, absolutely, that is fair, because we have had those privileges from the outset and have all the advantages. So there's something about what does levelling up really mean? And then there's something about liberation there, isn't it? How do we remove those barriers altogether? So we're looking at something huge in societal, if we were going to do that, around the inclusion exclusion agenda, which feeds health inequalities, I guess, which is where I come in. So I've popped for you there the ladder of engagement, and again, I don't know whether many of you might have seen that, but this is one way that we can start to think about where are our unconscious biases based on who we are, how we've lived, how we surround ourselves, and the influences that we've been subjected to in the lives that we happen to have led. And how do we work differently so that they don't remain as blind spots? So if we are values driven and we want to do the very best by our populations, I think when we talk about us, and if us is a group of privileged, well-educated, predominantly white people, then us is exclusive. And that exclusive group is going to miss opportunities of actually achieving what we're really all in our heart of hearts wanting to learn. So there's been some evidence that I draw on that says that people like us develop services in our own experience. So if we're trying to create services for people who are excluded by way of any kind of protected characteristic or kind of economic benefit or disbenefit, then unless we're working in partnership right from the outset to have our blind spots managed, we can't help ourselves, but we create services based on what we think. It's blindingly obvious, really, isn't it? But in doing that, what we've done is limit ourselves. And, you know, I'd invite you to have a think about services that perhaps you've wanted to put into place to tackle some kind of exclusion that didn't quite work. And this is where I look back on my career and think, gosh, I wish I'd have known then, because if I'd have worked more deeply in co-production, I think I'd have had better outcomes for the innovations, transformations and improvements that I've led over time, because I wouldn't have been coming to it with my narrow set of privileges and my narrow set of perspectives on life. So missed opportunities, and that doesn't do well for any of us because we've all come to do the best we can. Okay, next. Thank you. So blind spots. So these unconscious biases, they're unconscious because they sit at the back of our heads, and sometimes they argue with the things that are sitting at the front of our heads. So if you think about gender, for example, so I am actually quite feminist these days, but actually that really argues with what's in my unconscious bias, which is I am and should be a homemaker who cares firstly and foremostly for my children and my husband and stays at home. That's what my unconscious bias has taught me. It actually is completely in opposition to how I live my life and how I champion things. So that I live with that discomfort all the time because my back brain and my front brain are having arguments with each other about what's the right thing to do. So what I would invite you to do is to have a think about what are your blind spots. How do you know what they are? What's your journey of exploration that, you know, hopefully this talk might take you on. But today is a great example, isn't it, about how people like us find it easy to meet, to learn together, to share and to debate. What's your unconscious bias around experts by experience? So those groups who in this group here are digitally excluded, high at risk. What do you think about those kind of groups? And if you're thinking about working in true co-production, where actually yourselves as experts by learning and by position work in true partnership with equal power with people with lived experience. I'm just wondering, I hear people talking a lot about, well, we've got to be careful because they've got an agenda. If we invite them to the meeting, we need to make sure we pick the right people. They might get in the way of us doing what we need to do. So if that's something you're familiar with, I've heard that plenty of times. What does that really mean? I think that means that we kind of want to do something, but we're doing it in a paternalistic way, and we might not like what we hear, and we might not see that diversity of thought as being very helpful, because actually in our position of privilege, we somehow in our unconscious minds think we know the answers, and anybody who might challenge that may not be quite so welcome at the party. So again, just useful to reflect. So when we're talking about we're doing the work, who is we? Is it us or is it them? And who's us and who's them? And how do we expand the definition of who us is to do the very best work that we can in our leadership positions? Next slide, please. So Myron's maxims, I love these. I just can't help but share them with you. A couple of things that I wanted to do as I draw this session to the close. So people do own what they help create. So I popped in the chat bar before. I live 3 miles away from the Hattersley estate. And I'm really, as I was listening, I was exploring, what do I think about people that live on the Hattersley estate? I don't know anybody, but I have a view. That's a view that comes from my unconscious biases around what I know, around, you know, perhaps that group of individuals. So if I were doing that work, how do we help people in that group that are a high risk of digital exclusion create the solutions that are the right solutions for them? And in doing that, which might be difficult, it might feel uncomfortable, it might be that we need some help and we're a bit bumpy, our language is a bit awkward and we don't get it right first time. But then what we do in that co-creation space is people own what they help create. So the likelihood of success goes through the roof in doing that difficult piece of work at the beginning. The other one that comes in this is, you know, those who do the work do the change. So let's work in partnership with our groups where we identify those groups who may be at risk of digital exclusion. And let's do that work in partnership. Let's do the difficult stuff, seed some power, share some power, invite people in a genuine, authentic co-production space, allow ourselves to feel vulnerable in doing that, and actually then see the fruits of our labour increase as a result of doing that. So final slide for me, please. Who we are is how we lead. I don't know if anybody here is a fan of Brené Brown, but if you're not and you've liked anything that I say, I'd urge you go listen to a couple of podcasts, buy the books. Brilliant. This talks about our leadership. So in leading, we have to open ourselves up to our vulnerabilities. We're all people. We all have flaws. We all come to work to do the best we can, but we don't always do that in the way that gives us the best outcomes. So understanding ourselves, who we are, will make a difference in terms of how we lead and the success that we get in our endeavours. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I hope I've given you some nuggets to go away and think about. And yeah, I'm going to hand back now. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Still getting hearts and claps there, and there's been some amazing conversations going on the chat. So I feel like I need to take a moment. I'm kind of just blown away by what we've had over the last kind of 40 minutes, and I don't think I'm the only person who's kind of feeling that at the moment. I have totally disrespected the timetable today, and we have just a kind of short piece now for questions and discussion, but I felt we were all just absorbing, listening, kind of gripped on all three of our speakers, frankly, today, and the kind of honesty threads that we've heard. But I will pick up a couple of points, so you won't just hear me kind of gushing on. But that message from all three about kind of connecting with people, getting out there, getting real, is just kind of really sitting with me today, and some amazing thoughtful challenge from Caroline. Some of my questions now feel a bit inadequate given the space that we're in, but if Chris, Caroline and Theo could just switch your cameras on to rejoin me, I'll just pick up a couple of bits. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to pick up this, I think, phrase, Chris, that you used, willing and able. And I think, and that's sort of digital exclusion, digital participation. And Theo, I just kind of wanted to link that to both what you found in your engagement work and talking to families and users as well. And with staff. And we've had a couple of questions in the chat about how you might be working with staff, frontline staff, as well as citizens, families, residents, people who use services, the part of this work, and some of the challenges and barriers, and are you doing that, and are you bringing staff and users together, kind of that whole sort of piece. Theo, do you want to have a crack at that first?
Right, okay. I'm probably not going to answer your question. Am I okay being a bit politician-y and answering the question I want to answer? Is that all right?
Go for it, Theo.
Okay, right, all right, okay. So I've just been thinking about, there was something on the chat about, was there a moment when you thought, okay,
Yep.
That's a bit of a turning point? And I've been thinking about that, and I think it's probably the realization that we could develop, and we are intending to develop and commission, develop internally something, a really fabulous care tech service that offers brilliant devices, software, access to people. But actually, it's that it's those gatekeepers of how people get there, and just having to work with them. And actually, the product doesn't have to be all shiny and brilliant. It could be slightly less shiny, but the access to it just needs to be, and the understanding of it and the confidence in being able to use it needs to be there with families, carers, our staff. And that's where the energy should go. That's really changed my view about how we need to do things going forward. So that, I think it answered a bit of the question on the chat, but not your question, Claire. Sorry about that.
No, that's totally fine. I feel, Chris, actually, that was a really good question. So was there a kind of light bulb moment for you, or a series of light bulb moments in terms of you shifting your thinking about the work that you're doing?
I don't think there was an exact light bulb moment. I think a bit like the pandemic, it was kind of like it was a snowball of a series of issues that kind of came forward, and it does link to the question around staff, like internally in staff. Like, as soon as everyone went home, everyone had Teams, and not everyone could use it, and I'm sure everyone has had that issue of kind of going, hang on a minute, how do I do the presentation and then show me on the screen? And everyone's had that. And to a degree, there's an element of like, there's a skills element there, there's a confidence element there. But I think the issue around digital exclusion, as we were saying, like it affects lots of different areas of the public sector, kind of how we deliver things, the private sector, how those things are delivered, individuals' lives. And if anything, I think the pandemic just brought it to the fore more, and issues started to, as I say, snowball. So I think initially our work was on a GM Tech Fund, where we tried to provide devices to school children, especially children on free school meals in Greater Manchester. And it just kind of started like, because we were like, we know it's been an issue. It's definitely been in our plans to do something, but we've not taken it seriously enough up until the point where you actually need to take it seriously.
Yeah.
And then we were like, well, we need devices, but then we actually don't just need devices. We need the support, and we don't just need the device and the support. We need the data package, and then actually we need to provide motivation. And then some kids, and it kind of snowballed from there. And then when you start to think about children, you start to think about their support networks or their family. Are their family digitally connected? Are the support workers that are working with their family digitally connected? And it just snowballed, and it's become a big thing, partly from us pushing it, but also partly from us kind of realizing both internally within our own organization and from the works we've done that we need to engage with, co-produce solutions with the people who are affected, as well as the people supporting people who are affected by digital exclusion as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Chris. And it's kind of obvious, and maybe I've just shown my own note here, but we again, and Caroline, this speaks to your world, we tend to think digital inclusion and exclusion is something out there in communities, but of course, and we do think about digital skills for our own staff, but a lot of the work that we do is, the flashing up of the level of digital exclusion within our own organisations and staff and teams has been, I think, really exposed during COVID, hasn't it, in a helpful way. So in some ways, why can't we all go on this journey together? I've been a rubbish chair today because I've been listening so much, but I've let things run. I hope that was helpful. Can I just ask each of you really quickly, and apologies for the questions in the chat, but I'm just interested what you've learned from each other today, what your kind of takeaways are, just listening to each other, because I can see so many threads and opportunities to join this up, but I don't kind of want to overlay mine. I don't know which one of you would like to go first, but just a really quick little answer before I hand back to Georgia to close. Caroline.
Shall I go first? So I've just been scanning the feedback, and I was noticing, so I don't think we talk about who we are enough in this space. I think we talk about tools and systems and processes because they're tangible. We can create them, we can look at them, we can share them. I think our own personal journeys are the things that actually they're personal learnings, aren't they? But I don't think we talk about them enough. So I think I've learned from that. It's the first time I've given this kind of talk, and the feedback has told me we don't do enough of this.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Caroline. Theo,
Yeah, I think from Caroline's presentation, which is it's actually really interestingly continued a conversation that we've started within our management team, and just that the photos that you showed up of, say, your work colleagues. I think if we all do that, we can recognise where our thoughts might be going, even though with good intentions. And from Chris's presentation, just around that ability to almost focus in on areas. Actually, I talked about chunking things up, and I think that tool and the things that you talked about there, Chris, is a way of being able to do that and focus on the actually digital exclusion, why we might look at that and where we might have our our resources best deployed to support people.
Chris, just a quick.
Get out more. I think, the past 2 years, like we've, for a lot of the work we've done has been not always based in reality. It's based in data. It's based in kind of like information that other people have kind of gathered and they're bringing to the fore. And I've been able to get out more and meet more organisations, but I want to do more than that. And I think Caroline and Theo's presentations has certainly encouraged me to do even more of that and do my research more in that way and less on the, here you go, here's a nice data set and a Tableau tool.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm just, Chris, thinking back to your risk factors for digital inclusion, and there's so much, the human factor, the attitudes, the bias, it's not there in it, which is not a criticism of you at all. I'm literally thinking, how do we, as Caroline said, we've got these mechanistic, fairly safe things that we can kind of put people in boxes. How can we see the boxes but kind of bust through them and actually weave in the people, the names, not the numbers, the humanity and our own overlay to that? I'm fascinated, and my brain is absolutely in overdrive. Right, I will stop now. Let me hand back to Georgia quickly to close. And Gemma's very helpfully just posted evaluation in the chat. So if you want to do that while we're listening to Georgia, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Claire, and thanks, Gemma, for the evaluation link. Elle, if you just want to go ahead with our first poll while I'm speaking, that would be much appreciated. The tool that Claire presented today, the really useful building blocks tool, will be available as well as the accessible recording and the slide deck after this session. I'll send it around via email, and it will also be available on our CHIP Digital Resource Centre. For those of you who haven't heard about this site yet, it's the home of all of our resources that are emerging from this programme of work. We've recently added several podcasts, which are great to listen to in your free time. I'll just post that in the chat as well. It's also on this site that you can see our last event in our Masterclass series on the events tab. We'll be covering working with the care market, welcoming Telford and Regan Council and Dudley. I'm going to post a sign up link in the chat as well. But this will also be coming around via email, so don't worry if you don't manage to get that down. In advance of these masterclasses, or the last masterclass, it would be really helpful to hear how you found this masterclass. We've got a short evaluation form that Gemma's posted, and I'll also be circulating via email. This would really help us improve future masterclasses, as these polls are doing right now. They're only a couple of minutes long, so please do fill it in if you have time after the masterclass. If you do want to continue these discussions, we do have a closed group for local government colleagues where you can share about all things digital. It's called the Digital Technology for Adult Social Care Network. So we'd really appreciate if you join that if you haven't already. And before we close, really quickly on the minute, a big thank you to Rethink Partners for organising this masterclass. Thank you to Elle for taking us through the slide. Thank you to our incredible guest speakers, Chris, Theo and Caroline. We're so grateful to you all for sharing your experiences today and giving up your time. It's been a really, really useful session, I think personally and professionally. And finally, thank you all for attending. We really hope to see you at the last masterclass in a few weeks. I think just before we close, I'll put Elle, if we can put our contact details up on the final page, and I'll leave that up for just a few seconds. And then I think we're happy to close the masterclass. Thanks, everyone.